Welcome to the Augustine Institute Show. This evening I want to tackle a very difficult and yet important topic, and that is mental health and our youth and young adults. Before COVID happened, we've seen very troubling trends of increased depression and anxiety and even suicide amongst many young adults. The second leading cause of death for those aged 15 to 24 is suicide. It's a real tragedy, and it's a real difficulty that we face as a culture in the Western culture. And tonight I want to talk about mental health for our youth and young adults in light of COVID, because I'm very concerned that COVID is going to increase the challenges that youth face. When you look at isolation, social isolation, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, these are all the things that really put deeper challenges upon mental health. And right now, our youth are facing that in an unprecedented way. And that's why we want to address this issue. Many of you have probably seen our film series called The Search, which we aimed at introducing God and the topic of the church and faith to youth and young adults. And in that series, we touched upon the problem of rising rates of depression and anxiety and suicide amongst youth and young adults. And that corresponds with, or at least it correlates well with, over the last 2 decades, with an increase of breakdown in family and a loss of faith. Without family and faith, our youth are facing unprecedented challenges on securing their identity and their own self-esteem and their own sense of purpose and meaning in life. And right now with COVID, the challenges are just almost overwhelming. And I know I hear this from many of you on our Forum family. We get letters asking for prayer requests for youth and young adults. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've heard from a good friend of a tragic suicide, another friend of a teenage daughter who had to be admitted into a hospital with deep anxiety attacks. This is a challenging time for our youth, but there's things we can do to help them. And that's why we're going to address this topic. And that's why I've invited a very special guest who is a pioneering leader amongst youth and young adults for mental health and mental health strength. One of the great challenges we face with mental health is the idea of a stigma with mental health and spirituality. But that shouldn't be the case. The psalmist, who was very pious in Psalm 42, verse 5, said, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me?" The psalmist, the one who wrote that psalm, was a person of deep faith and piety. And yet they wondered at their own internal turmoil, their own internal mental health and spiritual struggles. We can't be ashamed of that. We have to face it. And we have to be present to others to help them. And so tonight we've got a very special guest and a very important topic that I'm glad you're going to join us with. Welcome back. I'm very excited about the guest we have this evening. He was introduced to me by a very good friend of ours, a mutual friend, who is a great advocate for mental health and for his Catholic faith, a friend of mine named Andy from Canada. And I'm really excited because our guest is from Canada, and we have so many parishes that subscribe to Forum and so many individuals in Canada that are part of our Forum family. And you're a key part of our audience, and I'm so excited to have somebody who's really an outstanding individual and leader in the mental health area, who's from Canada, who's going to share with us some of his insights tonight. He started his organization called jack.org about a decade ago with his wife Sandra, and that organization has now won many awards for its pioneering efforts at creating mental health awareness and knowledge amongst youth. They do a lot of peer-to-peer outreach, and it's really fascinating, the work they've done. Their website has really won several awards as well and is full of great resources in this area. And so it's a real honor for me to introduce to you Eric Windeler, who is the founder and executive director of jack.org, which specializes in helping and spreading great information and education and advocacy for mental health amongst youth and young adults. Eric, thank you so much for the great work you do and for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me. We just love talking about our work, and it's very important, so thanks for having me.
Well,
Toronto.
yeah, you have really been a game changer in Canada over the last decade with your organization and the group that you've brought together to really create advocacy and awareness about mental health for youth and young adult. Can you just give us a little bit of background with the audience? What inspired you to do this incredible work?
Well, I'd love to. It's a bit heavy at the start. I just want to let you know that, if you were to ask me 11 years ago today about, what's going on with your family, I would have said, we're the luckiest, happiest, healthiest family. My wife was a senior executive at one of our big banks. I was an entrepreneur doing well with a startup. And then we got a call from a police officer in March of 2010. And that poor gentleman had to come to our house and let us know that we had lost our son, Jack. They had found him in his residence room, age 18, first-year student at Queen's University, which is about 2 hours up the road here in Kingston, Ontario. So it was obviously out of the blue, completely devastating. We were destroyed. But I can talk relatively unemotionally about it now, 11 years later. But as we picked ourselves up off the ground, Sandra and I and our closest friends, we were thinking about this and saying, if this could happen to us, maybe it could happen to anybody. So I started looking into it. And as it turns out, I never went back to my day job. I've been doing this ever since. And we started with, for us, a very significant memorial donation to a national charity here in Canada called Kids Help Phone. It's our national youth crisis line. And that was a very important thing, Tim, that we did, because they coached us about how to get started. And I'll try to be brief about this, but we did a landscape scan. We said, where can we make a difference? And we did a 2-year pilot study with them, with 36 schools, both high schools and post-secondaries. And what we learned is that young people were being left out of this conversation, this most important conversation about them. You alluded to the second leading cause of death. It's the #1 health-related cause of death for young people is suicide in Western countries, and that's completely unacceptable. So we did this pilot, and what we really learned was that we needed to find a way to truly engage youth in this conversation. And we did that, and we piloted in the 3rd year, we piloted our approach with young people at the university where Jack was, Queen's University. And we really figured we were onto something. So that's when we incorporated and became an independent charity in the summer of 2013. And now today, fast forward, we have 50 full-time staff. But the key is we have about 3,000 young people in every province and territory of Canada who actually deliver all of our programmatic work and are key to our reach in about 250 communities all across Canada. We train and certify youth speakers in our Jack Talks program. They gather together and all year long do activities called initiatives in their Jack chapters. There's well over 200 of them now. And we hold summits. We call them Jack Summits, both at the national, regional, and local level. And those bring these young leaders together to learn from one another, kind of build a community and inspire them to go back and do work in their communities. And then we have an amazing digital resource. So we only keep 2 websites. One is jack.org. That's the home site. But we have a resource called Be There, which has been incredible. And maybe we'll talk a bit about that. Yeah. And that's at bethere.org, which is a digital resource that young people use to learn about mental health, learn how to support one another, and really kind of lean into those difficult conversations, because it's most likely young people will be the first ones to notice that somebody has changed their behavior and therefore might be struggling.
You're exactly right, Eric. I think that and I think this is one of the great features that you brought into the conversation is this peer-to-peer. You talked about stigma and how you and your wife said that this could happen to us, that could happen to anybody, and I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why people need to learn more about mental health, and we need to make this education normative for people so that parents and educators realize how important this is and how we have to recognize this to be able to deal with it. But I love what you're doing. You're helping teens to recognize this and own this, and that breaks the stigma at the peer level, because if we don't have kids in colleges and high schools being able to recognize this, a lot of this is going to, the stigma is going to keep this off to the side, and we're not going to address it in people's day-to-day lives, are we?
That's right, absolutely. Stigma is a huge thing. We're gradually overcoming that. But this peer-to-peer way that we didn't really stumble on it. We tested it out, and there's known evidence. And Tim, it's actually just common sense. We all learn from our peers the best. If you want to learn about hockey, it's unlikely. Sure, you could learn from a pro, but you're probably more likely to pick up some tips from one of your buddies, or football, or whatever it might be. But if you imagine two young speakers up on a stage who've been trained with about 50 hours of public speaking training to safely and hopefully, and that's the key thing, hopefully share their mental health journey. And at least 25% of the kids in the audience will resonate because they have struggled and they're hearing it from a peer rather than, a doctor or some sort of person my age, sort of preaching at them. It's really powerful, that peer-to-peer model, and it just makes total sense.
Well, I think it's making a big difference, and I think it's going to change the youth culture of seeing mental health as something that anyone and everyone can struggle with to one degree or another, and to recognize that in their friends, and that it takes away that sense of stigma that people then feel comfortable to share when they're struggling. And that's so important, to get youth to share with their peers that they're having struggles. That makes a big difference, doesn't it?
It's incredible. In 11 years now, I've obviously personally shared my story a lot. And in hindsight, I can't remember one person who's judged me for talking about my story. And that's really the fact of the matter. Those close to you care about you. They want to know they want to know how they can help you. And it has a natural effect. And another thing I just want to mention about the way we do the programs that I think is so critical, we call it a youth engagement, youth leadership strategy. And I really want to point out the youth leadership piece, because youth are our future, right? They're the ones who are going to take care of us when we're old, drive the economy, all the rest of it. And we just can't have too many of them underperforming. There's not only a social cost to that, there's a huge economic cost to that. And that's why this upstream prevention promotion work is known to have the highest payback, and it has actually an offsetting effect to the rest of the mental health system, because if you learn how to take care of your mental health, I often compare it to anti-smoking campaigns. If you can stop somebody from smoking before they unfortunately get addicted to that, you can prevent a whole legacy of problems and costly medical care from taking place. The same applies in mental health. Absolutely. So the leadership piece, the upstream piece are definitely magic, and we're really proud to be working that way.
I think that's exciting. To get preventative and get ahead of this is going to do a lot of good for a lot of people. I want to invite our audience to text in their questions, and also you can do that on the forum platform, making comments and questions, but also you can text in at 720-650-0100. And again, that's 720-650-0100. Text in with your questions. We'd love to take your questions and let you become part of the conversation. Well, Eric, I'm concerned about COVID adding a whole nother burden to this. What do you think we need to do right now in light of COVID, and how should that heighten awareness for parents as well as for youth?
Well, I think, it's pretty obvious to all of us how COVID has affected not just youth, but all of us. But it's more worrisome for youth because they haven't built their coping mechanisms. They're just learning about life. They're just developing their brain, their social connections, and so much has been taken from them. To have to do school remote and look at a screen like we're doing right now all day long. They can't meet up with their friends. They may have lost a job, all those sorts of things, but especially those who struggle. So it's hard enough on all of us, but it's especially hard for those who struggle. And then, anecdotally, I hate to say it, but I've been dealing with far more families who've lost their young ones. I'm dealing with them all along. They just reach out, they want some support, but it's definitely gone up in COVID times. But statistically, just to give you a couple of quick ones, the Kids Help Phone, I mentioned our youth crisis line, their calls and texts have almost doubled in COVID times. Wow. And there's also been a survey done pre and post pandemic, and one of the surveys talks about 18% of youth contemplating suicide prior it was 6% of youth the previous year. So it's serious stuff. And while suicide is still a fairly infrequent and obviously tragic thing, it's just a marker for the amount of struggle that's going on. and many young people have had multiple attempts and still get through it, somehow. But they're living their life suboptimally, and we've got to get around that and get ahead of it. COVID is just, in this second wave in particular, I know the U.S., like Canada, is going through it, is so difficult for people. And now we're in the depth of winter, and that adds another burden.
Eric, one of my fears, and I don't know if you've seen this, is that parents, because so many adults are struggling with so much of the crisis of COVID, right? With economic and social things and things at work, that it's easy to get distracted for parents more than normal to lose sight and track of their kids during this time. I think it's going to take more deliberate work for adults to look out for their youth. I mean, I know just for me personally, my son just graduated in December from college, but that fall semester, I just wanted to consciously try to keep in touch with him more often. And then I found out, early on in the semester that most of his classes were online, even though he was on campus. And I don't think a lot of parents recognize that their kid, they're off at campus, so their campus is meeting. That doesn't mean that they're socializing. It doesn't mean that they're with their peers. And so we really have to have a greater vigilance, ironically, even though we know mentally, like you said, it's a hard time for our youth. What are we doing to outreach? As family members, how can we call and connect with the youth in our lives to make sure that they're connected? What are some of the practical tips you'd recommend?
That's so valid, and we all need to be educated about mental health. And obviously, our target is what we call the transition years, age 15 to, we say 24 plus, because we don't kick kids out of our program if they're 25, but they're identifying as a young person versus an adult, on with their career and all the rest of it. But we also need to educate, families, caregivers, all those sorts of people. To make it personal again, if you took it back to Jack's story, I went down to the university a few weeks later and I talked to those students and the residence dons that were around Jack, and he was absolutely classic in the signs he was showing there. He wasn't coming out of his room. He hadn't attended class in months. And unfortunately, the stigma of it and the shame that's associated with it, he couldn't talk to us about it. But they all recognized that he wasn't behaving normally like he did the first month at school, but they didn't connect that to a mental health concern. And I'm convinced if we had only been given a heads up, or if he was able to put his hand up and say, I need some help, he'd still be here. We would have got him some help. We would have been in a whole different place. And that's still happening today. So it's really incumbent on parents and all those people that surround young people to show an interest. And I think a really important thing is, don't always reflect on everything that was perfect in your life and leave out all the tough stuff. Talk about how you had some struggles too. You have to normalize that conversation. We call it the rose and thorns, and often it's good around the dinner table to share, something that really good happened today, but hey, what was something tough you had to deal with? And that is likely to produce those important conversations if that young person starts to really struggle. And we know 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of them will. So it's important that we all educated.
I love that imagery of roses and thorns. And if we teach our kids about how we deal with our thorns, it models to them that how they can. That's beautiful. Eric, I want to go back to something that you have on that incredible resource on bethere.org. And I love the idea of being there for others and being present to them. That's so important. And one of the things that you talk about in Be There right away is the kind of 3 things to look for if somebody is having a significant mental health challenge, that there's a significant impact on them. And how do we recognize those signs? We're getting a lot of great questions that are coming in, and that's one of the questions. What are the signs of recognizing that somebody's maybe in a bit of a dangerous place that we should reach out?
Well, there's one that I would put all in caps, and I mentioned it earlier, but noticing a change in behavior, but not a change in behavior that's 1 day or 2 days. We can all have a bad day, or a 20-year-old can come home and be a little hungover the next morning, whatever it might be.
Yep.
But if it persists and it goes on for a couple of weeks, and it's something you notice that's a significant change in behavior from what that young person to be, that is a sign. there's all kinds of more specific things around, not socializing like you might, or consumption of, inappropriate substances, but change in eating patterns, any of that sort of thing. If a really athletic kid no longer wants to go out to practice, all those things are those, but I summarize it all that, and you don't want to just ignore those things. You really want to find the appropriate time, and you don't want to force yourself in on that young person at an inappropriate time, but let them know, I'd like to have a chat when you're ready, and but you can be a bit persistent about it and find that time.
Well, I love that BeThere.org gives some of those simple things to look for, like that significant change in behavior that lasts more than 2 weeks. That's a real flag, and that eating and all those things, and change of behavior. Those are great things for people to be aware of. The other thing that you mentioned in BeThere.org is kind of the 5 golden rules of how you can be there for somebody, and I just want to highlight that, because I think that's so important. If there's any of those 5 golden rules that you want to highlight, I was really moved by the simplicity and yet the power of them.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly touch on, the site was developed because our young leaders, after we were running for 4 or 5 years, were saying more and more of our peers are disclosing to us that they're struggling. And we don't want to learn how to be their doctor or their psychiatrist. We just want to understand how to be there for them. Wow. And ironically, I was able to obtain the URL BeThere.org because you can't talk about supporting somebody without saying the words "be there." But the 5 golden rules were really found on evidence that we researched out there. But the interesting thing was, we did a global landscape scan. We couldn't find a site that was both evidence-based and engaging to youth. And that's the real difference. The short videos that we have that explain the golden rules and all sorts of different scenarios are wonderful. But in order, they are: say what you see. So when you want to lean into one of those discussions, you just need to describe the changes you've noticed and tell them why you're worried. You don't want to judge, you don't want to make assumptions, but I see you haven't gone to soccer practice, and you used to always go to soccer practice. It could be that simple.
What I love about that is you don't have to get into the underlying possible motivations or issues. You don't have to get to the cause or make a judgment, like you said. You just have to talk about what you see. It's so simple. I love that.
And the lack of judgment, like judging someone, why don't you care about the team? All that sort of stuff would be inappropriate. Or why aren't you studying? You always used to study. Yeah. It's more like, I've noticed you're not studying. Yeah. And the second one is show you care, and this one is huge, because you really just have to let someone know that you love them and that you're there to help them. And your actions can speak louder than words. If it's appropriate, you can give them a hug. You can just stay there with them. And then we move on to, it's called hear them out. So you need to kind of open up that space for them. And you can ask some sort of a little bit more probing questions to help sort of validate their thoughts and feelings. So any questions there before I go on to the last two?
No, and then, yeah, please go on. I think that's just, you're nailing it, so I'm happy.
And then you move on, and the 4th golden rule is called know your role. So again, you're there to support them. You're not there to judge them or be their therapist. You're just there, and you're definitely not there to give them unwanted advice.
Eric, yeah, and I think that's so, to me, we talk about that in the Christian life as humility, right? You don't try to be more than you can be to them. Yep.
And you further need to protect your own mental health while you're doing it. So if you're someone who struggles, and you're a young woman, for example, and your friend is very anxious, you also need sometimes to find someone else who will help you with that, know your role, because it just might be a bit much for you. And then finally, if things are serious, you need to connect them to help. So that's the 5th one. And you can't force them to get help, but you can make it easier, because you can imagine if you're incredibly anxious or depressed, digging through all the websites and all the rest of that's probably not what you're good at that moment. So you can serve up some resources, and you could even dial the number of the helpline for them and say, can I talk to them, and then maybe you'll have a little word with them, that sort of thing. But there's, it's tougher in these times. Much more of the support is virtual, and navigation is a huge challenge. I'm sure it is in the US, it certainly is in Canada, of where to go. So that's another thing for families and young people to know about, is be educated about something, kind of know where the grocery store is before you have to go shopping, right? So know where those mental health supports are, because it's almost inevitable. That's why we want to reach all young people. Even though 1 in 5 will live with a mental illness, 5 in 5 have mental health. They need to know how to take care of it. And all of us will have to support somebody, or should be prepared to support somebody should they need it. So, and Be There has been great. It's won, like you said, won some awards, and we've even partnered now with a U.S. organization to roll it out there.
Eric, you have been there for so many over the last 10 years, and I know you're going to be there for many, many others in the years to come with your tremendous organization. I'm so grateful for you spending the time to share this with our audience, and you have really lived out those golden rules that you laid out there in your own life, and it's an inspiration to me and to many others. And so I'm deeply grateful for your witness and your love for others. You really are making a big difference, and grateful for you being here.
Thank you so much, Tim. And one present out of all of this after our tragedy is it actually helps you in your recovery if you help others. It actually does, and I'm sure you find that in your work. And it's a lot more satisfying than my automotive career, for example. Helping others really helps, and these young people that are helping their peers, it really helps them on their journey as well.
Well, you've honored your son with the work you're doing in his name, and it's blessing a lot of people. So thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me. All the best.
It's a joy.
God bless.
God bless. Well, I'm so delighted that everybody could get exposed to and hear the story of the wonderful work that Eric is doing at jack.org as well as bethere.org. It's wonderful resources, and one of the resources that along those lines that we've tried to provide for everybody here on form.org is a new series called The Sanctuary Course. Maybe you caught the show last week with Dr. Lillian Hendricks. We talked about the Sanctuary Course. It's a beautiful course that's designed with experts and clinical psychologists who care about mental health, as well as leading spiritual leaders in the Catholic Church to bring a spiritual framework to mental health, to strengthen mental health. And Eric mentioned that 5 out of 5 people need mental health. We all need it. And our spiritual faith in our Catholic and Christian faith can really strengthen that. And I think that's really important. I began with Psalm 42, verse 5. Why are you cast down within me, O my soul? And yet the psalmist then goes on and says, hope in God. And that spiritual faith and hope can lead that. And now I wanted to highlight the importance of the Sanctuary series. We provide it for parishes, so you can start a small group. You can do it individually by watching the 8-part series. We have some wonderful people on that series. There's a leader's guide and workbook that you can download for free on form.org, and you can go and you can find the Sanctuary easily on Form right now. And so that's a resource to help people, and it really dovetails with the great work that Eric Windeler is doing with jack.org, and we want to provide that spiritual resource for you. One of the things we're going to do next week is, we've gotten so many great questions and feedback during, in the formed forum for this, as well as in the text that you have. And so many questions that we can't answer during these short shows. So next week, our program is going to be completely dedicated to your questions. So I'm going to have Dr. Ben Akers, who's the executive director of form.org, on with me, and we are going to answer your questions that you submit next week live, as well as some of the great questions you've asked over the last couple of weeks that we haven't had a chance to get to. So we're going to answer those questions, and that's going to be something that I'm looking forward to. So I hope that you think of the key questions that you want us to tackle. We're going to be happy to do that, and that'll be really exciting. And I also want to thank all of you in our audience who support us, all of our benefactors, especially those of you in our mission circle who support us through the monthly Giving Society. you know, it's having programs like the Sanctuary and making those programs free to people is really because your support. And so I want to just give a shout out to everybody who supports us through the Mission Circle. Your monthly giving really helps us have this ministry and to provide these resources. And there's so much need out there, as you can hear on a program like today. We want to provide resources for more and more people so that they can grow stronger. So thank you so much for joining us, and may the Lord bless and keep you. Take care.